The rain was a cold, spiteful thing. It fell not with a gentle promise of life for the parched plains, but with the fury of a judgment. It soaked through the fine lace of Clara's wedding dress, turning the delicate white to a sullied, heavy gray that clung to her skin like a second, colder one. The hem, already torn when she had stumbled from the chapel door, was now caked in the thick, red mud of the street, a grim foreshadowing of the life that stretched before her. She stood alone before the crumbling facade of the Redemption Chapel, a name that felt like a cruel joke. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair from their carefully pinned arrangement, plastering them to her cheeks. An hour ago, she had been a bride. Now, she was a spectacle. Lightning spiderwebbed across the bruised purple sky, and in its fleeting, stark illumination, the world was painted in shades of silver and black. The vast prairie, which had once seemed a canvas of opportunity, now looked like an endless, churning sea of wet grass and despair. The few horses left tethered to the hitching posts stomped and whinnied, their eyes wide with fear of the storm, their instincts screaming to run. Clara understood the feeling. She felt the same primal urge to flee, but there was nowhere left to go. The town of Providence was a tiny, isolated island in this sea, and she was marooned upon it. Her husband, Henry, was gone. He had stood beside her before the preacher, his hand rough and calloused in hers, his voice steady as he spoke the vows. He had promised to honor and protect. Then, as the small congregation had begun to disperse, he had leaned in, his breath smelling faintly of whiskey and something sour she now recognized as deceit. "Wait here," he'd whispered, his eyes avoiding hers. "I have to see a man about a horse." He had smiled then, a thin, unconvincing stretch of his lips, and walked out into the burgeoning storm. He had never come back. The townspeople lingered. They huddled in the doorways of the general store and the saloon, their whispers carried on the wind like burrs, sticking to her, pricking her. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in disapproval, stared at Clara with cold, assessing eyes. The verdict was clear in that gaze. The girl was unworthy, cursed, perhaps. No good man like Henry Miller would abandon a proper bride unless she carried some hidden taint, some secret sin he had discovered at the last possible moment. The men were less subtle, a few cowhands, taking shelter under the wooden awning of the saloon, laughed openly. "Looks like Miller thought better of it," one called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the din of the rain. "Got a good look at what he was getting into and rode for the hills." Clara's jaw tightened. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy road that vanished into the gray curtain of rain, the road Henry had taken. Humiliation was a physical thing, a hot stone in her belly. She wrapped her arms around herself, the wet fabric of the dress chilling her to the bone, but she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She had cried enough as a child. She had no more tears to spare for a world that seemed to take and offer nothing in return. With a resolve that came from some deep, untouched wellspring of pride, she turned from the chapel and began the long walk home. Home. The word was a bitter irony. It was a small, two-room cabin at the edge of town, built by Henry's own hands on a plot of land that was meant to be theirs. Every squelch of her worn slippers in the thick mud was an echo of a broken promise. She felt the weight of every eye on her back, a tangible pressure that tried to force her to her knees, but she kept walking, her back straight, her head held high, a solitary figure in a ruined white dress, moving through the heart of the storm. The cabin was a mile from the center of town, a distance that felt like 100. By the time she reached the small, dark structure, twilight was bleeding into a starless night, and the rain had settled into a relentless, miserable drumming on the new shingled roof. She pushed open the door, which groaned in protest. The air inside was cold and still, holding the scent of fresh-cut pine and damp earth. It smelled of a future that had been stolen from her before it had even begun. A single candle sat on the rough-hewn table. Her hands trembled as she struck a match, the small flame sputtering to life, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel vast and haunted. The light confirmed her deepest fears. The cabin was half empty, stripped of anything of value. The Kentucky rifle, Henry's most prized possession, was gone from its hooks above the hearth. The small wooden chest where she had kept her dowry, $50 silver painstakingly saved by her father, lay on the floor, its lid splintered and its velvet lining torn. It was empty. She ran to the small lean-to that served as a stable. The stall was vacant. He had taken the bay mare, the sturdy horse that had been her last connection to her family. He had taken everything, the money, the horse, the rifle. He had not left her a wife, but a widow to a life that had never existed. He had left her with nothing but the dress on her back and a cabin that was nothing more than a wooden tomb. She sank onto the hard-packed dirt floor, the last of her strength leaving her in a ragged, silent sob. The humiliation in town had been a sharp, public pain, but this quiet, deliberate cruelty was a deeper wound. It was a violation not of love, but of trust. Her mind reeled back, seeking an explanation, a sign she had missed. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of practicality. Henry had arrived in Providence 6 months ago, a widower in his late 30s with a quiet intensity and hands that were never still. He had bought his plot of land and set to work, earning a reputation as a hard worker. Clara, an orphan since the fever took her parents 2 years prior, had been working for her keep at the boarding house, enduring the pitying glances and the endless drudgery. He had approached her one evening as she was sweeping the porch. He was direct, his words unadorned with the flowery nonsense other men sometimes tried. "Miss Peterson," he had said, holding his dusty hat in his hands, "a woman cannot make it alone out here, and a man needs a helpmate to build a life. I have a piece of land. I am building a home. I am asking you to be my wife." There had been no talk of love, no whispered sweet nothings under a moonlit sky. His proposal was a business arrangement, an offer of partnership against the harsh realities of the frontier. He promised safety, a roof over her head, a place in the world. For a young woman who had known nothing but precariousness, the promise of security was more seductive than any poem. She had seen the way men looked at a woman alone, the way doors closed, the way whispers followed. Henry offered her a shield. He offered her his name, and with it, a measure of protection from the loneliness and dangers of the West. She had accepted, believing that respect and trust could grow in the soil of shared hardship, that perhaps, in time, a quiet affection might bloom. Now, sitting in the cold, empty cabin, she understood the depth of her naivete. His promise had been as hollow as the empty chest at her feet. The betrayal cut so deeply not because it broke her heart. She was not sure she had ever truly given it to him, but because it shattered her hope. He had not just abandoned her. He had stripped her bare and left her for dead, exposed to the very dangers he had sworn to shield her from. The first few days were a blur of aching solitude. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but raw. The sun beat down, turning the muddy roads to cracked earth. Clara moved through her new reality like a ghost. The wedding dress, cleaned and mended as best she could, was packed away in her small trunk, a relic of a 5-hour marriage. She put on her simple calico work dress and faced the day. Survival was a series of relentless, grinding tasks. The well Henry had dug was shallow and brackish, so she had to haul water from the creek a half-mile away, 2 heavy buckets at a time, the wooden yoke digging into her shoulders until they were raw. She learned the bitter taste of failure, her first attempts at setting snares yielding nothing but frustration. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in her belly. She watched the rabbits and squirrels with a hunter's desperate focus, and after 3 days of gnawing hunger, she finally managed to trap a scrawny rabbit. Skinning it with her small kitchen knife was a gruesome, tear-filled ordeal, but the taste of the roasted meat, cooked over a meager fire, was the taste of life itself. The town remained a source of quiet torment. When she walked to the general store to spend her last few pennies on flour and salt, Mrs. Gable was there, her lips pursed into a thin, condemning line. The storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, who had always been kind to her before, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, charging her a few cents more than he should have. The women from the church sewing circle would cross the street when they saw her coming, gathering in a tight knot to whisper, their glances like stones. They had pitied her the day of the storm. Now they scorned her. She was the jilted bride, the woman who had taken up residence in a cabin that was not rightfully hers, a living embodiment of scandal. She was a pariah. She ignored them, her silence a shield more effective than any argument. She focused on the work. She learned the rhythms of the land, the way the sun baked the earth, the signs of a coming storm. She spent a whole day on a rickety ladder, patching a leak in the roof with a bucket of foul-smelling tar she'd traded a mended shirt for. Her hands became calloused, her face tanned by the sun, her body hardened by the ceaseless labor. The loneliness was a constant companion, a presence so vast and empty it felt like another person in the cabin with her. At night, the sound of the wind sighing through the pines sounded like a lament for all she had lost. Weeks turned into a month. Summer was beginning to wane, the nights growing cooler, a hint of the brutal winter that was to come. Clara knew she was not ready. Her small vegetable patch was struggling, and she had no rifle to hunt for proper game, no money to buy the supplies she would need to survive the snows. A cold tendril of fear would often wrap itself around her heart in the dead of night, a fear more profound than any she had ever known. It was on one such night that the sky broke open again. This was no ordinary thunderstorm. It was a biblical deluge, a storm that seemed intent on tearing the world from its very foundations. The wind shrieked, a physical force that battered the small cabin, making the timbers groan as if in agony. Rain fell in blinding, horizontal sheets, and the world outside her window was a black, chaotic mess, illuminated only by the violent, jagged flashes of lightning that came one after another. Clara sat at her small table, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the fire flicker and spit in the hearth. The cabin felt like a tiny, fragile boat tossed on a furious ocean. Every crash of thunder vibrated through the floorboards, a concussive force that rattled her teeth. She thought of the leaky patch on the roof, praying it would hold. It was during a particularly vivid flash of lightning, which lit the prairie as bright as day, that she saw him, a figure on horseback, riding hard against the gale. The horse was dark, almost invisible against the night, but the rider was a stark silhouette. He rode low, his head bowed against the punishing wind. As she watched, the horse seemed to stumble, its legs buckling in the treacherous, rain-slicked mud. The rider was thrown, a limp shape tumbling through the air before hitting the ground with a force she could feel even from inside. The horse, panicked, scrambled to its feet and bolted into the darkness, swallowed by the storm. The man did not move. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was pure, undiluted fear. A man, alone, out in a storm like this, could only mean trouble. He could be an outlaw, a drunk, a madman. The prudent thing to do, the safe thing, was to bar the door, douse the candle, and pretend she had seen nothing. She was a woman alone. She had no one to protect her. But the image of him lying motionless in the mud, at the mercy of the raging storm, would not leave her. She had felt that same helplessness, that same sense of being utterly abandoned to the cruelty of the world. She thought of him drowning in the mud, struck by lightning, freezing to death just a few yards from her door. Her own survival had been a daily, exhausting battle. Could she truly watch another human being perish when it was in her power to prevent it? The debate raged within her, a war between fear and a sliver of compassion she thought had long since withered and died. Finally, with a curse whispered into the roaring wind, she made her choice. Grabbing an old oilskin coat, she unbarred the door and plunged into the maelstrom. The force of the wind and rain nearly knocked her off her feet. The cold was shocking. Stealing her breath, she squinted against the deluge, her world a chaotic swirl of wind, water, and noise. She found him crumpled near the woodpile, half submerged in a growing puddle. He was a big man, and when she tried to move him, he was a dead weight. "Can you hear me?" she yelled over the storm, her voice snatched away by the wind. There was no response. With a grunt of exertion, she managed to hook her arms under his, and she began to drag him, inch by painful inch, toward the faint, welcoming glow of the cabin door. Her muscles screamed in protest. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down with him. It was a desperate, primal struggle. By the time she hauled him over the threshold and slammed the door shut against the storm, she was gasping for air, her body trembling with cold and effort. He lay on her floor, a heap of wet clothes and mud. She lit another candle, her hands shaking, and knelt beside him. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was all sharp angles, with a strong jaw shadowed by dark stubble. A faded scar cut a white line through his left eyebrow, giving him a severe look even in unconsciousness. His hair was black as a raven's wing, plastered to his forehead. Then she saw the blood. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the side of his chambray shirt, a deeper red than the mud that covered him. With fumbling fingers, she ripped the fabric open. A jagged gash ran along his ribs, angry and deep. It looked fresh. It was not a wound from the fall. Her breath hitched. This was worse than she had imagined. He was not just a drifter caught in a storm. He was a wounded man, a man running from something or someone. Every instinct screamed at her to throw him back out into the rain. But she could not. She had dragged him from the storm. His life was now, for better or worse, in her hands. Working with a strange, detached calm, she fetched her sewing basket and the small bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. She tore strips from a clean chemise for bandages. By the flickering light of the fire and the single candle, she began the grim task of tending his wounds. She poured a little of the whiskey onto a rag and gently, carefully, cleaned the gash. He flinched, a low groan escaping his lips, but he did not wake. The wound was deep, but it seemed the bullet, or whatever had caused it, had grazed him, tearing flesh but missing anything vital. She threaded a needle with shaking hands. She had never done anything like this before. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the needle through his skin. He jerked, his body arching in a silent protest of pain, and she whispered, "I am sorry. Hold still. I am sorry." She worked quickly, her stitches clumsy and uneven, but they pulled the edges of the wound together. When she was done, she bandaged his side tightly and managed, with great effort, to pull off his wet shirt and cover him with a dry blanket. She collapsed into the cabin's only chair, her body aching, her mind reeling. The storm still raged outside, a wild symphony of chaos. Inside, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the stranger's quiet, steady breathing. His name was Elias. She had seen it stitched crudely into the inside of his coat collar. He lay by her hearth, a man of blood and secrets, a piece of the violent world she had tried so hard to hide from, now resting in the heart of her home. She watched the firelight play over the hard lines of his face. He was vulnerable now, but she could sense a quiet strength in his stillness, a resilience that she recognized because she saw it in her own reflection. Mistrust coiled in her gut, a cold and sensible serpent. Yet, beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of curiosity, as faint and tenuous as the candle flame against the great, roaring darkness of the storm. for the first time in a long time. She was not entirely alone, and she could not decide if that was a comfort or the most terrifying thing of all. He woke to the smell of wood smoke and the dull, insistent throb of pain in his side. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The ceiling was low, made of raw timber, and the light filtering through a single small window was a pale, watery gray. He was on the floor, on a pallet of blankets near a hearth where a small fire crackled, its warmth a welcome contrast to the memory of bone-deep cold. He tried to sit up, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his ribs, forcing him back down with a choked gasp. "You should lie still." The voice was quiet, a woman's, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. He turned his head slowly. A young woman sat in a straight-backed chair, a tin cup of what smelled like coffee held in her hands. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. He recognized her then, a fleeting image from the storm, a determined face, dark hair plastered by rain, a surprising strength as she had dragged him from the mud. "Where am I?" His voice was a dry rasp. "My cabin," she said simply. "You took a fall from your horse just past my wood pile." She did not mention the blood. She did not need to. He could feel the tight pull of the bandage and the crude, burning line of stitches beneath it. He pushed himself up on one elbow, ignoring the protest from his body. His eyes scanned the small, spare room. It was clean, but achingly empty, with the feel of a place not fully lived in. "I'm obliged to you, ma'am," he said, his voice gaining a little of its strength. "The storm, I was trying to outrun it. It was a half-truth, but it was all he was willing to give." He looked down at his bare chest, then at the neatly folded, clean blanket that covered him. "You tended my wound." It was a statement, not a question. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It was bleeding. I did what I could." He finally managed to sit upright, his back against the rough stones of the hearth. He looked at her properly now. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe not yet 20. There were dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was direct, unwavering. She was not easily frightened. "My name is Elias," he offered. "Clara," she replied, her voice flat. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. He was a stranger, a wounded one at that, in her home. The situation was a dangerous one for a woman alone. He understood the calculations happening behind her cautious eyes. "My horse," he said, breaking the silence. "It bolted, a black gelding, branded with a double diamond on the left flank." "I have not seen it," she said. He nodded, a knot of frustration tightening in his gut. The horse was all he had left in the world. He looked around the cabin again, his gaze taking in the patched roof, the single chair, the noticeable lack of a man's belongings. He looked at her, at the quiet resilience in the set of her jaw. "I am in your debt, Clara," he said, his voice low and serious. "I have no money to offer you, but I am not an idle man. My side will need a few days to mend, and my horse will likely find its way back here looking for shelter. If you would allow me to stay, I can offer my labor in exchange for food and a roof. I can see this place needs work before the first snow. I can fix that roof proper, chop you enough wood to last the winter. Whatever you need." Clara hesitated. The offer was a godsend and a curse all at once. The fear she had felt last night, the primal instinct to protect herself, was still a cold knot in her stomach. This man was a mystery, his wound a testament to some violent trouble he was embroiled in. To let him stay was to invite that trouble into her life, a life already burdened by scandal and hardship. The town would talk. They would do more than talk. But then she looked at her hands, calloused and sore from hauling water and swinging an axe that was too heavy for her. She thought of the coming winter, a monstrous, white beast that would swallow the plains and lock her in this cold cabin. She had no rifle, almost no food stores. and a well that was more mud than water. Her pride had kept her going this far, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than any storm, that pride would not keep her from starving or freezing when the blizzards came. She was strong, but she was not strong enough to fight the land and the winter alone. She needed help. "You can sleep in the lean-to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There is hay. It is dry." She stood, her movements stiff. "But if you bring any trouble to this door, you will be gone, wounded or not." Elias met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something other than pain or caution in his eyes. It was a flicker of respect. "You have my word," he said. And though she had learned the hard way what a man's word was worth, she found herself, against all reason, believing him. The first few days passed in a state of uneasy truce. They moved around each other with the careful, measured steps of two wild creatures who have stumbled into the same territory. Silence was the currency of their household. It was a thick, heavy blanket that covered everything, broken only by the necessary questions and answers. "Is there more wood to split?" "The water bucket is full. Supper is on the table." Elias was true to his word, despite the pain in his side, which made him move stiffly. He was a tireless worker. The rhythmic thud of his axe became the new heartbeat of the homestead, a steady, reassuring sound that echoed from dawn until dusk. He mended the broken latch on her door, reinforced the walls of the lean-to, and, as promised, climbed onto the roof and repaired her shoddy patch with a skill that spoke of long practice. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his hands sure and capable. Clara watched him from the cabin window as she kneaded dough or mended her worn dress. He was a man built of lean muscle and corded strength, his body a testament to a life of hard labor. He never spoke of his past, never offered any explanation for the wound in his side or the haunted look that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. He was a closed book, and she was too wary to try and read the pages. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a routine formed. She would wake before dawn, light the fire, and put on a pot of coffee. She would leave a cup for him on the porch steps, along with a plate of whatever she had cooked, usually biscuits and gravy or a thin cornmeal mush. He would take it without a word. And then the sound of his work would begin. They worked side by side in the struggling vegetable garden, their hands in the same dirt, pulling weeds in a shared, silent battle against the stubborn earth. He showed her how to better brace the tomato plants, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second, a spark of warmth that surprised them both and made them pull away as if burned. Trust was not a decision. It was a slow, creeping vine, growing in the spaces between the silences. It grew when his horse, as he had predicted, returned after 2 days, drawn by the familiar scent of its master. Elias spent an hour calming the animal, speaking to it in low, soothing tones, his voice gentler than any she had yet heard him use. It grew when he noticed her struggling with the heavy water buckets and, the very next day, began the back-breaking work of digging the well deeper, striking a fresh, clear vein of water that tasted sweet and cold. It grew every evening, when he would sit on the porch steps, sharpening his knife or cleaning his saddle gear, a silent, watchful guardian as darkness fell over the plains. He never tried to enter the cabin after his work was done. He respected the invisible line she had drawn, and in doing so, he earned a small piece of her confidence. But their small, isolated world could not remain untouched for long. A week after his arrival, Clara had to go into town for supplies. As she walked into the general store, the usual hum of conversation died, replaced by a sudden, pointed silence. "Mr." Henderson looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Mrs. Gable, who was inspecting a bolt of fabric, turned and gave Clara a look of such profound disgust that it was like a physical blow. "We hear you have taken in a boarder, Clara." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. A man, a stranger. Clara's face burned. I have hired a man to help with repairs before winter, she said, her voice colder than she intended. Repairs, Mrs. Gable sniffed, sharing a knowing look with the other women in the store. Is that what they are calling it now? To think. We felt pity for you. We prayed for you. And all the while, you were just waiting to bring another man into that house. Shameless. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Shameless. Clara grabbed her small bag of flour, threw her coins on the counter, and walked out without another word. Her back straight, her head high. But the word followed her, a brand on her skin. The sheriff's visit came 2 days later. He rode up to the cabin on a fine gray mare, his silver badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Sheriff Brody was a fair man, but he was a man who valued order and propriety above all else. He found Elias splitting wood near the barn. Afternoon, the sheriff said, his eyes taking in Elias's worn clothes, the scar on his face, and the way he held the axe with a comfortable familiarity. I am Sheriff Brody. I do not believe we have met. Elias, he replied, not offering a last name. He did not stop his work. The axe fell, splitting a log with a clean crack. Folks in town are talking, the sheriff said. Getting straight to the point, he dismounted and leaned against the fence, his gaze shifting to the cabin, where he knew Clara was watching. They say a man has taken up residence with the Miller girl. I am working for my keep, Elias said, his voice even. I am sure you are, the sheriff said, but you need to understand how it looks. She is a woman alone, her reputation already in tatters. Having you here, it is inviting scandal. It is dangerous for her. He looked directly at Elias. I want to know what your business is here. Before Elias could answer, the door to the cabin opened and Clara stepped out. His business is helping me survive, she said, her voice shaking with a quiet fury. Something no one in this town, including the law, has offered to do. Sheriff Brody had the grace to look chagrined. Clara, I am just trying to protect you. A woman cannot live like this, alone with a man who is not her husband. It is not right. What is not right? She shot back. Is being abandoned and left to starve while the good people of Providence whisper behind their hands. Elias is a decent man who is working for his board. That is all. Now, if you have no official business, Sheriff, we have work to do. The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, then at the silent, imposing figure of Elias. He shook his head, a look of weary resignation on his face. You are a stubborn woman. Clara Miller, I am just warning you, no good will come of this. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and disapproval in his wake. That night, Elias was quieter than usual. He sat on the porch, staring out at the darkening plains, the sheriff's visit having stirred something deep within him. The sight of the badge, the easy authority of the lawman, had transported him back to a time and a place he tried every day to forget. The memory came unbidden, sharp and brutal as a shard of glass. He was in another town, a lifetime ago. He was the one wearing the badge, polishing its silver surface with a sense of pride and purpose. He had a wife then, Sarah, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes and hair the color of corn silk. He had a daughter, Lily, a 5-year-old whirlwind of sunshine and questions. He had a small house with a white picket fence, a life built on the simple, sturdy foundation of law and family. He was a protector. And then the outlaw gang had come, seeking revenge for a brother he had sent to the gallows. They had not come for him in the street, in a fair fight. They had come at night, to his home. The memory was a chaotic nightmare of smoke, the roar of gunfire, the splintering of wood. He remembered fighting with a desperate, savage fury. But he was one man against 4. He remembered the sight of Sarah's blue dress, crumpled on the floor. He remembered the terrible, final silence from Lily's room. He had survived, but he had failed in his most sacred duty. He had not been able to protect them. The next day, he had walked into his office, taken off the badge, and placed it on the desk. He had surrendered his authority, his identity, his very soul. He had been drifting ever since, a ghost haunted by the faces of those he had lost, the guilt of physical weight he carried every single day. He was so lost in the memory that he did not hear Clara come out of the cabin. She set a plate of food on the step beside him. "You did not eat," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain she could not understand. "Thank you," he murmured. They sat in silence for a while, the stars emerging in the vast, inky sky. The land around them was a reflection of their own lives. It was barren in places, scarred by drought and fire, yet it clung to life with a stubborn, desperate tenacity. New grass grew from the ashes. Wildflowers bloomed in the cracked earth. It was a land of struggle, but also of resilience. He began to do more than just chores. He took her to a secluded clearing and, using the pistol he kept hidden in his saddlebags, began to teach her how to shoot. The first time she held the weapon, it felt heavy and foreign in her hands, a cold instrument of death. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Out here, there is a law, and there is what is right. They are not always the same thing. You need to be able to protect yourself when the law is not around." He stood behind her, his hand gently guiding hers, showing her how to aim, how to control her breathing. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." The first shot was a deafening explosion that made her yelp, the recoil jolting her arm. But the second shot was steadier, and the third hit the tin can he had set on a stump. A small, fierce surge of pride went through her. He was giving her back a piece of the power Henry had stolen. He was giving her a tool not of aggression, but of survival. Weeks passed. The uneasy silence between them slowly transformed into a comfortable one. They began to talk, not of their pasts, but of the present. They talked of the weather, of the best way to store potatoes for the winter, of the hawk that circled their cabin every afternoon. They were small, simple conversations, but they were the threads that began to weave their two solitary lives together. One night, the sky turned a familiar, bruised purple. The air grew heavy and still, pregnant with the promise of a storm. Lightning flickered on the horizon, a distant, silent pulse. A feeling of dread, cold and familiar, settled over Clara. Storms were no longer just weather to her. They were omens, reminders of abandonment and loss. She fled the cabin, needing to be anywhere but within its four walls. She went to the barn, the scent of hay and animals a small comfort. She leaned against the rough wood, her face buried in her hands, and for the first time since her wedding night, she allowed herself to cry. The tears were a hot, bitter flood of all the humiliation, the loneliness, the shame she had bottled up for so long. She cried for the life she had lost, for the fear of the coming winter, for the crushing weight of being so utterly alone in a world that did not care. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very ground. In the stark, fleeting light, she saw Elias standing in the barn doorway, his face etched with concern. He had followed her. He walked toward her slowly, his boots silent in the soft dirt. "Clara?" he asked, his voice low. "Go away," she sobbed, her voice muffled by her hands. "Please, just leave me be." He did not leave. He stood before her, a solid, unwavering presence in the flickering gloom. "The town. What they say," she choked out, the words tumbling from her in a rush of pain. "They look at me like I am dirt. They call me shameless. I did nothing wrong. Elias, I just wanted to be safe." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before it gently touched her arm. His touch was not forceful or demanding. It was warm, steady, and incredibly gentle. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face illuminated by another flash of lightning. His eyes were full of a deep, aching sadness, an understanding that went beyond words. He had seen this kind of pain before. He had lived it. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding hers. The space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was a fragile, terrifying connection between two broken, lonely souls. He lifted his other hand and gently brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was as soft as a whisper. He leaned in, his hesitation a palpable thing. Then his lips met hers. The kiss was brief, tentative, and tasted of rain and sorrow and a desperate, unspoken longing. It was not a kiss of passion, but of shared grief, a fleeting moment of solace in a world that offered none. The shock of it, the unexpected tenderness, broke through her haze of tears. She pulled back abruptly, her hand flying to her lips. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on her. He was a stranger. She was a ruined woman. This was impossible. This was dangerous. This was another promise waiting to be broken. "Your promise means nothing," she whispered, the words a hoarse, broken sound. They were not for him, not really. They were for Henry, for her father, for a world of men who had offered her safety and given her only pain. They were the cry of her own wounded heart. Before he could respond, before she could see the flicker of confusion and hurt in his eyes, she turned and fled back to the cabin, stumbling through the rain. She slammed the door, leaning against it, her body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable mixture of guilt, confusion, and a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. The line had been crossed. The storm had finally broken, both outside and within. The kiss lingered in the air between them, an unspoken thing with a life of its own. In the days that followed, the comfortable silence they had built was replaced by a brittle, charged quiet. They worked as they always had, their movements synchronized by routine. But now they were acutely aware of each other, of the small space that separated their bodies as they passed in the garden or by the woodpile. It was a space that hummed with the memory of that brief, rain-soaked touch. Clara would find her eyes drifting to him as he worked, to the way the sun caught the black of his hair, the powerful flex of the muscles in his back as he swung the axe. A frightening warmth would curl in her stomach, a feeling so foreign it felt like a sickness. She would immediately look away, her cheeks burning with a shame she could not articulate. Her whispered words, "Your promise means nothing," haunted her. She had not meant them for him. Not truly. They were an echo of a deeper betrayal, a reflexive defense against a tenderness she had never expected to feel again. Now, she feared he had taken them as a rejection, a judgment on the impulse that had led him to her in the barn. Elias, for his part, had retreated back into himself, his silence deeper and more impenetrable than before. He worked with a grim, relentless focus, as if trying to exhaust the turmoil within him. He had broken his own unspoken code. He was a drifter, a ghost, a man who carried ruin in his shadow. His purpose was to pass through lives, not to intertwine himself with them. The kiss had been a moment of weakness, a selfish grasp at a comfort he had no right to. He looked at Clara, at the quiet strength she had forged from her own ruin, and he saw a life struggling to take root in barren soil. He feared his presence was like a poison, that by touching her, he had tainted her with his own cursed past. He had watched one family be destroyed because of him. He would not be the cause of another's downfall. They were two souls caught in a delicate, painful dance of stolen glances and unspoken feelings, both of them haunted by the line they had crossed, both too afraid to speak of it, and too broken to ignore it. The fragile tension was shattered on a cool, late autumn afternoon. Clara was feeding the chickens, scattering the last of her grain, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, expecting to see Elias, but her heart froze in her chest. It was Henry. He was thinner, his clothes threadbare and caked with the dust of long travel. His face was gaunt, his eyes holding the wild, desperate glint of a cornered animal. The sour scent of desperation and stale whiskey clung to him like a shroud. He looked not at her, but at the cabin, at the neat stack of firewood, at the newly deepened well, his gaze one of greedy assessment. "Looks like you have been busy," he said, his voice a gravelly sneer, "keeping the place warm for my return." Clara straightened up slowly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The fear that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. "This is not your place, Henry," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore. You abandoned it. You abandoned me." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that startled the chickens. "A man cannot abandon what is his. I was away on business. It did not go as planned." He took a step closer, his eyes finally landing on her, raking over her with an air of ownership that made her skin crawl. "I ran into some bad luck at the tables down in Fort Worth. Lost it all. The horse, the money. So I came back to what is mine. This land, this cabin." He gestured vaguely at her. "And you?" "I am not yours," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I have the paper from the preacher that says you are," he retorted, his voice rising. "This is my property, and I find another man's axe in my woodpile. I see another man's work all over my land. The whole town is talking, saying you have opened your home and your bed to some drifter." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "Did you, Clara, did you disgrace my name while I was gone?" Before she could answer, a voice, cold as a winter morning, cut through the air. "Let her go!" Elias stood by the corner of the cabin, an axe held loosely in one hand. He was not menacing, not yet, but there was a coiled stillness about him, a promise of violence that was more terrifying than any overt threat. His eyes were fixed on Henry's hand on Clara's arm. Henry released her, shoving her away as if she were a sack of grain. He turned to face Elias, a smirk twisting his chapped lips. Well, the stray dog himself, enjoying my hospitality. I have come back to claim what is mine. You can be on your way." "This place is hers," Elias said, his voice flat, emotionless. "She worked it. She held it. You gave up any right to it when you rode away and left her to the judgment of this town." "The law says otherwise," Henry sneered. "She is my wife. The land is in my name. Everything here is mine." He took a step toward Elias, his posture arrogant, trying to reclaim some of the authority he had lost. "I know about men like you, drifters, running from something. I heard whispers about you on the trail, whispers about a lawman who got his family killed. Is that you? Did you run away after you let them die?" The world seemed to stop. The air grew thin and cold. The axe in Elias's hand did not move, but something in his eyes died. The haunted look was replaced by a void, a black, empty space of pure, undiluted pain. He had spent years running from those words, and now, here they were, spoken by a worthless creature in a forgotten corner of the world. "You should not have said that," Elias whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. He dropped the axe. The movement was slow, deliberate, and then he launched himself at Henry. It was not a fight. It was an explosion. All the grief, all the guilt, all the rage that Elias had carried in silence for years erupted in a torrent of savage violence. He tackled Henry to the ground, and they rolled in the mud and chicken droppings, a tangle of flailing limbs. Henry was no match for him. Elias's movements were fueled by a pain so deep it had become a source of terrible strength. He landed a punch that made a sickening crunch as it connected with Henry's jaw. He was not just fighting the man who had hurt Clara. He was fighting the ghosts of the men who had taken everything from him. He was fighting his own failure, his own shame. He ended up on top of Henry, his hands closing around the other man's throat. Henry's face began to turn a mottled purple, his eyes bulging with terror as he clawed uselessly at Elias's wrists. Elias's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes unseeing, lost in a past he could not escape. He was no longer in Providence. He was back in the smoking ruins of his home. And this was the man who had done it. He squeezed harder, the tendons in his forearms standing out like ropes. It was Clara's scream that brought him back. It was a sound of pure terror and despair, a sound that sliced through the red haze of his rage. "Elias, no!" she cried, grabbing his shoulder. "Stop, please! Do not become him! Do not do this!" Her voice, her touch, was an anchor in the storm of his memory. He looked down at the sputtering, terrified man beneath him. And then he looked at Clara, at the horror and pity in her tear-filled eyes. He was scaring her. He was becoming the monster he believed himself to be. With a ragged, shuddering gasp, he released his grip and rolled off Henry, collapsing onto the muddy ground, his chest heaving. Henry lay gasping, gulping in air, his face a mask of terror and hatred. It was at that moment that two riders appeared, Sheriff Brody and his deputy, drawn by the sounds of the fight. They took in the scene at a glance. Henry, the legal husband, bruised and gasping on the ground. Clara, the disgraced wife, weeping. And Elias, the drifter, covered in mud and blood, the evidence of his violent rage plain for all to see. "That is him! Sheriff!" Henry rasped, pointing a shaking finger at Elias. "He tried to kill me on my own land!" Sheriff Brody's face hardened. He had warned them. He had told her no good would come of this. He dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You," he said to Elias, his voice hard as iron. "On your feet. You are a danger to this town. I want you gone. Be out of Providence by dawn. If I see your face again, I will lock you up and throw away the key." He did not ask for an explanation. He did not care. He saw what he expected to see: trouble. That night, the cabin was filled with a silence more profound and painful than any they had yet shared. Elias packed his meager belongings into his saddlebags, his movements stiff and slow. Clara sat at the table, watching him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The law had spoken. Her reputation, already in ruins, was now irrevocably destroyed. She was the woman who harbored a violent criminal, the adulteress who had driven her husband away and incited an attack upon his return. "Do not go," she said, her voice a plea. Elias stopped, his back to her. "I have to. Clara, the sheriff was right. I bring you nothing but danger." "That is not true," she said, standing and walking toward him. "Henry is the danger. You protected me." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her stop. It was a look of such profound self-loathing that it took her breath away. "I almost killed him," he said, his voice raw. "Did you see my face? Did you see what I am? What he said, it was the truth. My family. They died because I was not strong enough to protect them. I bring ruin. Clara, it is all I have ever known. I will not bring it to you." "You are wrong," she whispered, tears tracking paths through the dirt on her cheeks. "You are the only safety I have ever known. Henry promised me safety, and he gave me this. You promised me nothing, and you gave me everything. You taught me how to be strong. You made me feel like I was not alone." She took a hesitant step closer, her hand reaching out, wanting to touch him, to hold him there. "Please, Elias, stay!" His face was a mask of anguish. Her words were a comfort and a torment, a vision of a life he could never have. To stay would be to endanger her further, to subject her to the violence that always seemed to find him. To leave was to abandon the only flicker of light he had found in years of darkness. He believed that leaving was the only way to truly protect her. "I cannot," he said, his voice breaking. He turned away from her, unable to bear the look in her eyes. "I cannot." A bitter silence fell between them. She knew there were no more words that could change his mind. He was a man locked in a prison of his own past, and she did not have the key. He walked to the door, his saddlebag slung over his shoulder. He paused, his hand on the latch. and looked back at her one last time.
"I am sorry, Clara,"
he whispered. Her resolve broke. The fear of being alone again, truly and utterly alone, was a physical pain.
"I feel,"
she started, her voice a choked whisper.
"I feel something for you that I cannot name. It frightens me more than he ever did."
The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and heartbreaking. He gave a single, sharp nod, his face a mask of stone, and then he was gone, disappearing into the cold, starless night. Clara sank to the floor, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the distance, each hoofbeat a nail in the coffin of her hope. Days later, the news came. It traveled through Providence like a prairie fire, a story told with a mixture of fear and morbid satisfaction. Henry, having been run off his own land, had fallen in with a bad crowd. He had joined a gang of outlaws, desperate men who had begun raiding the outlying farms, stealing livestock and supplies. The violence that had been confined to her small plot of land was now spreading across the county, and the town, in its fear and its need for a scapegoat, turned its eyes to her. The whispers grew louder, more venomous. It was her fault. She had brought the drifter, the killer, into their midst. She had provoked her husband. She was a curse, a woman who had scorned the laws of God and man. And now they were all paying the price. Clara Miller, the abandoned bride, was no longer just shameless. She was the harbinger of their doom. The first snow came not as a gentle promise, but as a silent, creeping thief. It dusted the dead, skeletal fingers of the cornstalks in Clara's garden and laid a thin, white shroud over the hard, unforgiving earth. Winter deepened its hold with a relentless, brutal patience. The wind, which had once been a lonely sigh, now honed itself to a razor's edge, slicing through the chinks in the cabin walls that Elias had so carefully mended. The days grew short and gray, the sun a pale, distant memory. Clara's world shrank to the four walls of her cabin. The cold was a living entity, a constant, predatory presence. It turned the water in her bucket to a solid block of ice overnight and made the iron of the well pump handle burn her skin. Soon, the well itself gave up, its mechanism freezing with a choked gasp. From then on, she had to venture to the creek with an axe, chipping away at the ice to get at the frigid, dark water below. The work was exhausting, and the yield was meager. Hunger, which had been a dull ache, sharpened into a constant, biting pain. The last of her potatoes were gone, the smoked rabbit meat a distant memory. She was reduced to a thin, watery soup made from dried beans and the last of her flour. She grew gaunt, her dress hanging loosely on her frame, her eyes large and shadowed in her pale face. The isolation was a physical weight, a crushing silence that filled every corner of the cabin. There were days she did not speak a word, her own voice a strange and rusty thing when she finally did. The town of Providence might as well have been on the other side of the world. No one came. No one checked on the cursed woman in the outlaw's cabin. She was alone, utterly and completely, adrift in a sea of white. It was in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the wind howled like a banshee and the cold was a physical pain, that she would allow herself to think of him. She began to write letters, not with the intention of ever sending them, but simply to keep the memory of him alive, to pour out the words she had been too proud or too afraid to say, on scraps of wrapping paper, with a small piece of charcoal from the hearth. She wrote to a ghost. "Elias," one letter began, the letters shaky from the cold. "The silence you left behind is louder than any storm. I did not mean what I said that night in the barn. My words were a shield, built from old hurts that had nothing to do with you. It was a foolish one. I was a fool. I see you sometimes. When I close my eyes, I see you splitting wood, the axe rising and falling. I feel the warmth of your hand when you taught me to hold the pistol. You were right. A person must know how to protect themselves. I am trying to be strong, as you taught me, but my strength is failing. The winter is a beast, and it is devouring me piece by piece. I pray you are somewhere warm. I pray you are safe. I pray you have not forgotten the woman you saved from the storm." She would read the words, then feed the fragile paper to the fire, watching as the charcoal confessions of her heart curled into black ash and disappeared up the chimney. They were prayers sent to a God she no longer believed in, offerings to a memory that was both a comfort and a torment. One night, the wind died down, and a heavy, smothering silence fell over the snow-covered plains. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black, star-strewn sky. Clara lay on her cot, huddled under every blanket she owned, listening to the frantic beating of her own heart. It was in this unnatural quiet that she heard it, a new sound. It was the dull, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, muffled by the deep snow, but drawing steadily closer. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of hunger and exhaustion. No one traveled at this time of night, not in this cold. Her first thought was of Elias, a wild, impossible surge of hope that was extinguished as quickly as it came. The sound was too heavy. It was more than one horse. She scrambled from the cot, her bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. She crept to the window and peered through a small crack in the shutter. 4 riders were dismounting in the moonlight, their forms dark and menacing against the stark white of the snow. One of them, she recognized instantly. Even in the gloom, she knew the slump of his shoulders, the arrogant tilt of his head. It was Henry. Panic seized her. She looked around the cabin, her eyes wild. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The rifle Elias had left her, a parting gift she had found on the table the morning after he left, stood in the corner. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was heavy, a cold, solid weight of responsibility. She checked the load, her fingers clumsy, her mind racing with Elias's instructions. The front door exploded inward, torn from its hinges with a single, violent kick. Henry stood there, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Behind him were 3 other men, their faces hard and shadowed by the brims of their hats. One was a mountain of a man with a thick, greasy beard. The other 2 were wiry and rat-faced, their eyes darting around the cabin, taking in its poverty with contempt. "Evening, wife," Henry sneered, stepping inside, bringing the biting cold with him. "Looks like your new man has flown the coop, left you all alone."
"Get out, Henry,"
Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. She raised the rifle, the barrel wavering in her unsteady hands. The men laughed. The big bearded one took a step forward. "Look at that! The little mouse thinks she is a lion." "She knows how to shoot," Henry warned, though his tone was mocking. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the near-empty shelves. "We are hungry, Clara, and cold. We need supplies, food, blankets, whatever money you have hidden away."
"There is nothing here,"
she said, her heart pounding against her ribs.
"You should know. You took it all."
"Do not lie to me," he snarled, his good humor vanishing. He nodded to the 2 smaller men. "Search the place." As they moved to obey, Clara's survival instinct took over. She would not be a victim again. She would not stand by and let them take the little she had left. She aimed the rifle at the big man's leg, squeezed her eyes shut, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. The man roared in pain and surprise, clutching his thigh as a dark stain spread across his trousers. The recoil of the rifle slammed the stock into Clara's shoulder, knocking her off balance. In that moment of chaos, Henry lunged. He was on her before she could recover, his hand grabbing the rifle barrel and wrenching it from her grasp. He threw it into a corner and backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling to the floor. Her head spun, the taste of blood sharp in her mouth. Henry stood over her, his chest heaving, his face a mask of fury. "You stupid woman," he hissed. "Did you really think that would stop us?" He kicked at her side, a dull, sickening thud that stole her breath. "You are worth nothing now. Less than nothing. a used-up, worthless piece of property. He raised his pistol, the barrel a cold, black eyes staring down at her. This was it, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. This was the end of her struggle. A shot rang out, but it was not from Henry's gun. It came from the doorway. The window behind Henry shattered, and he grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face as he spun around. A dark shape stood in the ruined doorway, a silhouette against the moonlit snow. The figure held a pistol, smoke curling from its barrel. He stepped inside, and Clara's heart stopped. It was Elias. His face was grim, his eyes chips of ice. He had heard the rumors, whispers in a saloon 2 towns over of Henry Miller's gang and the wife he had left behind in Providence. A cold dread had seized him, a premonition so strong he had turned his horse around and ridden for 2 days straight, pushing through the snow, driven by a fear he had not felt since the night he lost his family. "Get away from her," Elias said, his voice a low, deadly growl. What happened next was a chaotic ballet of muzzle flashes and deafening reports. The 2 smaller outlaws drew their weapons. Elias fired again, his shot precise, and one of them crumpled to the floor. The other fired wildly, his bullet thudding into the wall just inches from Clara's head. The wounded man by the door, his face contorted in pain and rage, raised his own pistol and fired at Elias. The shot went wide, but it gave Henry his chance. While Elias was focused on the other men, Henry scrambled behind the table, using it for cover, and took aim at Elias's back. Clara saw it happen. She opened her mouth to scream a warning, but it was too late. At that exact moment, the 3rd outlaw, panicked and trying to get a clear shot at Elias, fired his pistol. His aim was wild, his hands shaking. The bullet missed Elias completely, crossing the small room and striking Henry squarely in the chest. Henry stared down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, a look of profound, almost comical surprise on his face. He looked at Clara, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Then his eyes went vacant, and he collapsed behind the table, dead before he hit the floor. The last standing outlaw saw his leader fall, saw his companion on the floor, and his nerve broke. He threw down his pistol and bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. The wounded man, groaning in pain, tried to drag himself after him. Elias walked over, kicked the man's gun away, and stood over him, his own pistol steady. The man looked up into Elias's cold eyes and fainted. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the broken door and the crackle of the fire. The cabin was a scene of carnage, the floor littered with bodies and the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Clara pushed herself up slowly, her body a symphony of aches. She stared at the still form of her husband behind the table, at the other man lying motionless near the hearth, the reality of what had happened, of the violence and death that had invaded her home, crashed down on her. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her. Elias rushed to her side, his face etched with concern.
"Clara, are you hurt?"
She shook her head, unable to speak. She looked at him, then at the bodies, and a single, ragged sob escaped her lips.
"The blood,"
she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did not want this blood on my land." She collapsed then, the last of her strength, her will, her very spirit, giving way. She did not fall to the floor. Elias caught her, his arm strong and sure around her. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her away from the carnage, to the small chair by the fire. He knelt before her, prying the rifle she had unknowingly clung to from her frozen fingers. He took her trembling hands in his own, his warmth seeping into her icy skin. He said nothing. There were no words for this. He simply held her hands, his grip a steady anchor in the terrifying storm of the aftermath. He built up the fire, the flames casting a warm, dancing light that pushed back against the shadows and the cold. He tended to the cut on her face, his touch impossibly gentle. They sat like that for a long time, in a quiet communion of shared grief and trauma. The wind howled outside, and the fire crackled within. There were no words, only the sound of the wind and their own ragged breaths. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, and the sobs she had held back for so long finally came, a torrent of pain and fear and a strange, terrifying relief. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, weathering the storm of her grief as he had weathered the storm of the plains. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back, her eyes meeting his in the firelight. The world outside, the town, the judgment, the whispers, none of it mattered anymore. She had faced death, and in the aftermath, there was only one truth, one fear that remained.
I no longer fear what others think,
she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear.
I only fear losing you again.
Spring did not arrive with a triumphant burst of life, but with a slow, reluctant thaw. The great white silence of winter was broken first by a whisper, the sound of a single drop of water falling from an icicle. Then the whisper became a murmur, the murmur a trickle, and soon the trickle became a roar as the snows melted into churning, muddy rivers that overflowed their banks and flooded the plains. The land, stripped bare and scoured by the ice, felt reborn, but it was a raw and fragile rebirth. The first shoots of green that pushed their way through the muck were a testament to life's stubbornness, a promise whispered in the face of desolation. Elias stayed. There was no discussion, no formal agreement. He had returned to her in the heart of the storm, and now, in its aftermath, he remained. The bodies of the outlaws, including Henry's, had been taken away by a grim-faced Sheriff Brody, who had asked few questions and offered no condolences. The incident was a black mark on the town, and they were eager to bury it, both literally and figuratively. Together, Elias and Clara began to rebuild. The broken door was replaced, the shattered window repaired, the bullet holes in the walls were plugged, scars on the body of their home. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their shared labor a silent conversation, the rhythm of saw and hammer, the scrape of a shovel in the damp earth, the quiet grunts of exertion. These were the sounds of their new life. The silence between them was no longer the brittle, charged thing it had been before. It was a comfortable quiet, a shared space built on the bedrock of a trauma endured and a loyalty proven. They moved through their days with an easy, unspoken understanding. He would rise first, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and start the fire. She would follow soon after, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the small cabin. They planted new seeds in the garden, a small plot of land that had seen so much blood and despair. Kneeling in the dark, rich soil, their hands side by side. Planting seeds was an act of faith, a defiant belief in a future that was not guaranteed. He mended the fences that had been trampled in the fight, his movements sure and steady, and she would bring him a dipper of cool, sweet water from the well he had dug for her. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, he carving a piece of wood into a small, intricate bird, she mending a tear in his shirt. Sometimes, a small smile would pass between them, a fleeting acknowledgement of the fragile peace they had found. He was not just a drifter, and she was not just a victim. They were two survivors, quietly, painstakingly, building a life from the wreckage of their pasts. But their small island of tranquility could not hold back the tide of the outside world. As the mud on the roads dried and travel became easier, the reality of their situation became starkly clear. Providence had not forgotten, and it had not forgiven. When Clara rode their small, newly acquired wagon into town for salt and flour, the fragile peace was shattered. The townspeople treated her not as a widow who had defended her home, but as the source of the plague that had befallen them. Mr. Henderson, at the general store, refused to serve her. "I will not sell to the likes of you," he said, his face a mask of cold judgment, turning his back to her to serve another customer. The other patrons in the store, people she had known her whole life, either stared at her with open hostility or looked away, as if her very presence was a contagion. The whispers followed her down the street, sharper and more venomous than ever before.
"That is her,"
a woman muttered to her friend, pulling her child closer. "The one who brought the outlaws lives in sin with that killer." The word had changed. He was no longer just a drifter. He was a killer, and she, by extension, was something worse. They accused her of sin, of a wickedness so profound it had drawn violence to their doorstep. Some of the more superstitious folk even whispered the word witchery, blaming the harsh winter and the late thaw on her unholy alliance. She returned to the cabin empty-handed, her face pale, her hands clenched so tightly on the reins that her knuckles were white. Elias saw the look on her face and knew instantly. He said nothing, but that evening, he rode out, returning after dark with a sack of flour and a small bag of salt, obtained from a trading post 10 miles downriver where his face, and hers, were unknown. The breaking point came on a Sunday, against Elias's quiet objections. Clara insisted they go to the chapel. "I will not be a coward," she said, her chin set in a stubborn line.
"I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I will not hide."
The moment they stepped through the chapel doors, a hush fell over the congregation. Every eye turned to them, a collective stare of condemnation. They took a seat in the back pew, two isolated figures in a sea of hostile piety. The preacher, Reverend Gable, a man whose thin frame seemed to contain an ocean of righteous indignation, climbed to the pulpit and fixed his cold, furious gaze directly on Clara. His sermon was not about forgiveness or redemption. It was a sermon of fire and brimstone, of wrath and judgment. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, of the woman who brings sin and ruin into the world of men. He did not use her name, but every word, every gesture, was aimed at her like a poisoned arrow. He spoke of the recent unpleasantness, the violence that had disturbed their peaceful community, and he laid the blame squarely on the doorstep of those who live in defiance of God's law, who open their homes to darkness and their hearts to sin. "When a woman forsakes her sacred vows and takes up with a man of violence," he thundered, his voice echoing in the rafters, "she becomes a vessel for chaos. She invites the wolf into the fold, and the blood of the righteous is on her hands." Clara sat frozen, her face ashen, the hatred of the crowd washing over her in palpable waves. She felt Elias tense beside her, his body coiling like a spring. She placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea for him to remain calm. But when the sermon ended and the congregation began to file out, their path was blocked by a wall of grim-faced men and women. Mrs. Gable stood at their head, her face pinched with a triumphant malice. "You are not welcome here, sinner," she hissed at Clara. "You have brought a curse upon this town." That was when Elias moved. He stepped in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. He was not loud, he was not aggressive, but his presence commanded a sudden, fearful silence. He looked not at the women, but at the men who stood behind them, at the preacher who watched from the pulpit. "You speak of sin," Elias said, his voice low and steady, but carrying to every corner of the church. "You know nothing of it. You hide in your wooden houses and your self-righteousness, and you judge what you do not understand." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "I once had a family, a wife and a daughter. They were not taken from me by sin. Reverend, they were not struck down by God's judgment. They were taken by lawless men, the same kind of vicious, godless men that this woman fought in her own home, alone, while you were all safe in your beds." He let the words hang in the air. She is not the sinner here. The sin is in the hearts of those who would stand by and watch a good woman suffer, who would abandon her to the wolves and then blame her for the blood on the ground. You should be ashamed. His words, meant to shame them into silence, instead ignited their smoldering resentment into open flame. His confession of his past, his defense of Clara, was seen not as a plea for understanding, but as a challenge to their authority, to their entire way of life.
"He admits it!" someone shouted from the crowd. "He is a killer! He brought his curse here!"
The mood turned ugly, the crowd pressing in on them. Elias, his face a grim mask, grabbed Clara's hand and pushed his way through the mob, toward the door. They stumbled out into the harsh sunlight, the crowd spilling out of the chapel after them, their whispers turning into angry shouts. As they scrambled onto the wagon, the first stone was thrown. It struck the wooden side of the wagon with a sharp crack, then another, and another. A small, sharp rock grazed Clara's cheek, drawing blood. Elias whipped the reins, and the horses, panicked, bolted forward, carrying them away from the church in a cloud of dust and curses. They rode in silence, the sound of the horses' frantic hooves a frantic counterpoint to the turmoil in their hearts. When they reached the relative safety of their land, Elias brought the wagon to a halt. His face was pale, his jaw tight with a fury that was directed not at the town, but at himself. "We have to leave Clara," he said, his voice ragged. "Tonight. I was a fool to think this could work. I cannot protect you from this. I only make it worse. Every town I go to, the trouble follows. We will pack what we can and ride west. We can find a place where no one knows us." Clara looked at him, at the anguish in his eyes, the familiar, self-hating belief that he was a bringer of ruin. And in that moment, something inside her solidified. She had been running her whole life, from poverty, from loneliness, from grief. She would not run anymore. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. She touched the small cut on her cheek, her fingers coming away with a smear of blood. "This is my home, Elias, this land, this cabin. It is all I have. It is the only thing I have ever fought for. I will not be driven from it by ignorant, hateful people. I am not running from my life again." "Clara, they will not stop," he insisted, his voice desperate. "They will make your life a living hell. They could burn us out. They could kill us." "And you think running will save us?" she countered, her voice rising with a passion he had never heard from her before. "You have been running your whole life. Elias, has it kept you safe? Has it brought you peace? Or has it just led you from one lonely place to another? We make our stand here, together." They stared at each other, two opposing wills locked in a battle of fear and hope. In the distance, the sky was darkening, the familiar bruised purple of an approaching storm. Thunder rolled, a low, guttural growl. The fight went out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. He looked at her defiant stance, her blazing eyes, and he saw a strength that dwarfed his own. She was not a woman who needed his protection in the way he thought. She needed a partner, an ally. He led the horses to the barn, and they worked in a tense silence, unhitching the team, their earlier argument hanging between them. As darkness fell and the first drops of rain began to fall, they retreated to the cabin. The storm gathered its strength, the thunder growing louder, closer. The air inside the small room was thick with unspoken emotions, with the raw, exposed nerves of their love and their fear. He stood by the window, watching the lightning flash across the prairie, a mirror of the turmoil in his own soul. She came and stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. "I am afraid," she whispered into the growing darkness. "But I am more afraid of being without you than I am of them." He turned to face her. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, making her eyes deep, dark pools of an emotion he could no longer deny. All the barriers he had built, all the walls of guilt and self-loathing, crumbled in that moment. The world outside, with its hatred and its judgment, faded away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in the heart of the storm. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Clara," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he had thought long dead. And then there were no more words. He lowered his head and kissed her. And this time there was no hesitation, no tentative exploration. It was a collision of desperation and tenderness, of a hunger that had been starved for a lifetime. It was a fierce, possessive claiming, a silent vow in a world that had tried to tear them apart. She answered him with a ferocity of her own, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, her body molding against his. It was an act of rebellion against the loneliness and the fear, an affirmation of life in the face of so much cruelty. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the cot, the thunder outside a roaring symphony to the storm they had unleashed within. In the flickering firelight, they came together, not just as a man and a woman, but as two halves of a single, broken soul, finding wholeness in each other's arms. It was desperate and it was tender, fierce and yet achingly gentle, a moment of pure, unadulterated truth in a world built on lies. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blankets, listening to the rain lash against the roof. The storm was at its peak now, a wild, cleansing deluge. Clara traced the line of the scar over his eyebrow, her touch light as a feather.
"I love you, Elias,"
she confessed, the words whispered into the quiet space between them. "I think I have loved you since the first moment you made me feel safe." She paused, a shadow of fear crossing her face. "But I am afraid the world will destroy us." He turned, pulling her closer, his arms a circle of strength around her. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them not the haunted drifter, but the protector he was always meant to be. "Henry promised to protect you and broke his vow," he said, his voice low and solemn. "I promised you nothing, but I am making you a promise now. Clara, I will not let them harm you. I will not let the world destroy us. I will not fail you." His words were not spoken into the air. They were forged in the fire of his past and sealed with the conviction of his heart. This time, he would not fail. This time, he would protect his family. As he spoke, the sky broke open. The rain came down not as a judgment, but as a flood, washing the world clean. A furious baptism for the new life they had just begun. It was the same rain, the same storm, as the night they first met, but this time they were on the same side of the door, facing it together. They woke not to the gentle gray of dawn, but to a world undone. The storm had passed, but its true fury was only now being unleashed. A deep, guttural roar filled the air, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin, a sound of immense and terrifying power. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his movements sharp with an old, ingrained instinct for danger. He threw open the door, and they stared in stunned disbelief. The prairie had vanished, swallowed by a churning brown sea. The creek, normally a gentle, meandering stream, had become a raging torrent, a monstrous, hungry beast that was devouring the land, carrying with it uprooted trees, splintered fences, and the bloated carcasses of unlucky livestock. The water was already licking at the edges of their small rise of land, and in the distance, partially obscured by a veil of morning mist, the town of Providence was fighting for its life. "The river," Elias breathed, his voice grim. The mighty Redemption River, which normally flowed a full 2 miles south of the town, had jumped its banks and was now pouring its rage directly into the low-lying settlement. Without another word, he turned, pulling on his boots and coat. His movements were swift, economical, the movements of a man who knew precisely what chaos demanded. He was no longer the haunted drifter. He was the lawman, the protector, answering a call that was deeper than any conscious thought. "You are not going alone," Clara said. It was not a question. She was already dressing, her hands moving with a speed and purpose that matched his own. "Clara, it is too dangerous," he started, his voice firm. "You stay here. The ground is higher. You will be safe." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with the same fire he had seen the day before.
My life is here, Elias. Not just in this cabin, but with you. We made our stand. We will not be separated now. I am not the woman you found in the storm. You taught me to be strong. Now let me be strong with you." He looked at her, at the unshakable resolve in her gaze, and he knew that arguing was a waste of breath. She was right. They would face this together. He gave a single, sharp nod, a world of understanding passing between them. He saddled the two horses while she gathered a coil of rope and the last of her clean bandages, stuffing them into a saddlebag. Riding into the chaos was like riding into a nightmare. The water was already knee-deep on the main road, a cold, swift current that tried to pull the horses' legs out from under them. The town was in a state of pandemonium. People were screaming, running from their homes with armfuls of their most precious belongings, their faces masks of terror. The lower part of town, where the poorest families lived in small, hastily built shacks, was already submerged, the water swirling around the eaves of the roofs. They separated, their purpose unspoken but perfectly aligned. Elias rode his horse into the deeper water, his powerful frame a bulwark against the current. He emerged moments later with two small, sobbing children clinging to his neck, their mother waiting behind him, her eyes wide with gratitude. He deposited them on the higher ground near the general store and plunged back in. Clara, meanwhile, focused on the livestock. She saw a pen of panicked hogs, their squeals of terror piercing the roar of the flood, about to be swept away. With a courage she did not know she possessed, she dismounted, wading into the thigh-deep water, and managed to break open the gate, driving the animals with shouts and slaps toward a small hill. She saw Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, trapped on her porch, surrounded by rising water, her face a strange mixture of terror and her usual pinched disapproval. Without a second thought, Clara guided her horse to the porch. "Take my hand," she shouted over the din. "Mrs." Gable hesitated for only a second before her survival instinct overcame her pride, and she allowed the woman she had scorned to pull her onto the back of the horse and ferry her to safety. They worked for hours, a blur of desperate, heroic action. They became a team, their movements fluid and intuitive. He would rescue the people, and she would follow, gathering the children, calming the hysterical, leading the animals. They were a force of nature in their own right, battling the destructive power of the flood with the unyielding power of their will. Through the chaos, they saw Reverend Gable, but he was not helping the living. He was frantically trying to save the inanimate. He had organized a small group of his most devout followers to form a human chain, passing the precious hymnals and the silver communion plate from the chapel, which was slowly being inundated. "The house of the Lord must be preserved," he cried, his voice shrill with a frantic piety that bordered on madness. Elias shouted at him to save the people, to help the families trapped in their homes. But the preacher was deaf to anything but his own holy mission. It was a mission that would cost him his life. As he waded back toward the chapel for one last armload of books, a section of the riverbank upstream gave way, sending a new, powerful surge of water through the town. The waves struck the small chapel and the building, its foundations already weakened, groaned and then collapsed inward, taking the man who had loved it more than his own flock down with it. As the day wore on, the storm, which had seemed to be passing, gathered its strength for one final, furious assault. The rain began to fall again, a cold, blinding deluge. The only escape route for the families trapped on the north side of town was a long, wooden bridge that spanned a deep ravine. It was old, its timbers groaning under the strain of the floodwaters that now raged just feet below its deck. Elias and Clara were helping a group of families cross when they heard the scream. A woman, Mrs. Peterson, a young mother with a newborn, had slipped on the slick planks, her ankle twisting beneath her. She lay trapped, her leg caught between two boards. As the bridge began to make a terrible, splintering sound, the rest of the townsfolk, panicked, scrambled for the far side, leaving her behind. Get the rest of them across," Elias yelled to Clara. He did not hesitate. He ran back onto the groaning bridge, the structure swaying violently beneath his feet. He reached the trapped woman, his hands working quickly to free her mangled leg. The bridge gave another lurch, a main support beam snapping with a sound like a cannon shot. He finally pulled her free and, half carrying, half dragging her, he pushed her towards safety. "Go!" he yelled. He turned to follow, but it was too late. With a final, agonizing shriek of tearing wood and snapping rope, the bridge gave way, collapsing into the churning torrent below. Elias, caught at its center, was thrown into the raging water. Clara screamed his name, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. She saw his head break the surface once, his arm flailing, before he was sucked under again, swept away by the current's merciless power. For a single, paralyzing moment, she froze, the world narrowing to that single horrifying image. And then, the promise she had made to herself, the love she had confessed to him, the very core of her being, took over. She was not running. She would not lose him. She kicked off her heavy, waterlogged boots and, without a second's hesitation, dove from the bank into the icy, churning water. The cold was a physical shock, stealing her breath, but she pushed through it, her arms pumping, her eyes scanning the debris-filled water. She saw him again, further downstream, his body snagged for a moment on the branches of a submerged tree. He was not moving. With a surge of desperate strength fueled by love and adrenaline, she swam toward him, fighting the current that tried to drag her under, to pull her away. Debris struck her, a piece of wood gashing her arm, but she barely felt it. She reached him, her fingers closing on the collar of his coat. He was a dead weight, his head lolling, a bloody gash on his forehead where he must have struck a rock. Dragging him was a seemingly impossible task. The current was a live thing, a monster trying to claim them both. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, her vision began to tunnel, but she held on. She wrapped an arm around his chest, locked her fingers in his coat, and kicked with every last ounce of strength she possessed. She did not think, she did not feel. She only knew that she could not let go. She did not know how long she fought. It could have been minutes or an eternity. Finally, her feet touched mud. With a last, ragged sob of effort, she dragged him from the main current into a shallow eddy, and then, inch by painful inch, up onto the muddy bank. She collapsed beside him, gasping for air, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. He was alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. A crowd had gathered on the bank, the people he had just saved, their faces a mixture of awe and horror. Someone, a man whose child Elias had carried from the flood, ran forward and helped her pull him further from the water's edge. Mrs. Gable, her face stripped of all its former malice, appeared with a dry blanket, wrapping it around Clara's shaking shoulders, her eyes full of a dawning, tearful respect. He survived, but only just. He had a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, and a severe concussion that kept him drifting in and out of consciousness. The gash on his head was deep and bled profusely. They carried him to the sheriff's office, one of the few buildings on high ground that had remained dry, and laid him on a cot. Clara did not leave his side, all through that long night. As the storm finally broke and the lightning faded to a distant flicker, she was his anchor. She cleaned and stitched the wound on his head, her hands, once clumsy with a needle, now steady and sure. She set his arm in a makeshift splint. She bathed his face with cool water, whispering to him, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling him to hold on, to stay with him. The townspeople came and went, bringing food, more blankets, words of encouragement. They no longer looked at her with scorn. They looked at her with a quiet reverence, a profound respect for the woman who had faced down their judgment and then saved one of their own, and in doing so, had saved the man who had saved them. The rumors did not just turn to respect, they turned to legend. Weeks passed. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a world coated in a thick layer of mud and debris. But beneath the mud, life returned with a vengeance. The land, nourished by the river's silt, bloomed with an almost violent vibrancy. The plains were a carpet of green, dotted with the brilliant colors of wildflowers. The air was clean and fresh, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth and new beginnings. Elias healed slowly. He remained weak for a long time, the ordeal having taken a heavy toll on his body, but with Clara's constant care, the strength gradually returned to his limbs, the clarity to his eyes. The town, in a collective act of penance and gratitude, helped them. The men came to their cabin and, in a single day, built a new, sturdy barn. The women brought food, seeds for their garden, a milk cow. They had faced the wrath of nature together, and in that shared crucible, the old judgments and hatreds had been washed away, leaving behind the foundations of a true community. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias and Clara stood on the small porch of their cabin. They had decided to stay. This land, once a place of exile and sorrow, was now their home. It was a place they had earned, a place they had sanctified with their courage and their blood. They were building a small ranch of their own, a testament to their resilience. A familiar scent filled the air, the smell of distant rain. A new storm was rolling across the plains, its thunderclouds dark and heavy against the vibrant sky. Clara watched it approach, a faint smile on her lips. She was no longer afraid of storms. She remembered the night he had first kissed her, in the barn, the taste of rain and sorrow on his lips. It seemed a lifetime ago. Elias came up behind her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close against his chest. He was still scarred, still weary, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they watched the storm together. She leaned her head back against him, the familiar solidity of him, a comfort she would never take for granted. "Your promise means nothing," she murmured, her voice soft, the words a gentle echo of a past self. "Unless you stay." He smiled, a faint, true smile that reached his eyes. He tightened his hold, his promise not just a word, but a physical presence. "Then I'll never break it." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the undeniable perfume of hope. It was an ending born not of dreams, but of survival, a love story written not in the stars, but carved into the harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving heart of the West. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts.